One of the fundamental reasons why we write a contract is because although we might know, outside people won't know. So imagine you build a business, be it a management business, be it a record company business, be it a publishing business, and you get to a ripe old age and you decide to sell your business. Okay? You have all these, we had Steve here yesterday, has all these labels and all these artists. How do you prove to somebody who wants to buy your business that you actually own the licenses in the sound recordings, licenses in the publishing? How do you prove it? You actually need something written, not for your benefit, but for the benefit of a third party who might just want to assess the value of your company. One of the fundamental, because a lot of the time people say, well, we understand what we mean by the agreement. We have a verbal agreement, everything's fine with us. What about outside parties? You need to lay it out quite clearly. What we're going to look at today is, first of all, starting with the basis of a contract. Let me start with the main headings of the things that you will find in a contract, or you should find in a contract. And then we will look at them as to how they apply to the different forms of agreements. What I've done here is try to simplify the things that you should find in an agreement. And for the purposes of this particular seminar, I've tried to simplify them in a way by having term, territory, rights, royalty, retention, advances, and accounting. Now, it's a bit of alliteration there by having term, territory, and then rights, royalty, retention, advances, accounting. This is more of an aide-memoire than necessarily the order in which you will find these things in a contract. One of the things that I usually say about certainly the kind of record deals that you get in the UK is if you sign a record deal with a major label in the UK, the contract will run to about, and it's changed over the years, but currently around about 70 pages. Okay? And the first 3 pages tell you what you're going to get. The next 67 pages tell you why you're not going to get that. Okay? So the devil in the contract is in the detail. Okay? So let's start off at the top of a contract. Parties. What do I mean by parties? Exactly. Who is the contract between? You know, who are the main protagonists who are going to sign this contract? So that's the first thing you will need to have at the top of the contract, is agreement between me and you, the record company and the performer, the manager and the performer, the performer and the publisher. Okay? So that's the first thing that you will have. The second thing we have is the term. What do we mean by the term? We mean by how long is the contract going to last? Now, what I'll do here is I'll talk about the way that particularly record contracts and publishing contracts, and to some extent for your marketplace, production contracts tend to function. The Musicians Union basically has these contracts in the UK available online as specimen contracts. They are very useful at looking at the basis for an agreement. Part of the problem with them, and it's not that I have a problem, but part of the problem with them is that all the contracts that the Musicians Union tend to put up online are very artist friendly. So they are not necessarily what you will find in standard terms of agreement in a contract as it comes to you. They are what the MU feels is fair. right? Did you have? Oh, okay. But what the MU feels is fair, and often, I generally agree with the musicians' union, but that is not necessarily what you will find in the commercial world. Okay. So, talking about term. Here we should talk about the extended contract term. The standard way that a recording contract and a publishing contract are put together is they are put together for a period of time, the term. So it might be a year, it might be 2 years, it might be 3 years. In the paper I sent you, it was 5 years. Right. Absolutely correctly identified. 5 years is a very long time to sign up for somebody with no probationary period to see how it's working, certainly on the management point of view. So what happens is contracts are typically put together for an initial period of time and then extended by what are known as options. And the options are generally exercised by either the record company or the publishing company in this case. So there is an initial period of time, say a year, and then let's start off, I'll talk about record deals first because that's probably easiest. The options are extendable by the record company only. The artist will not get the option as to whether or not they're going to extend. The artist will be subject to the full term of contract unless the record company decides to shorten it. So let's assume that you have what is more common these days, which is a 3-year contract. The way that it will work is that you will have an initial period of 1 year. If things are going well from the record company's point of view, they will then, towards the end of that year, exercise the option to continue for the second year. If at the end of the second year things are still going well, they will exercise the option to extend for another year, for the third year. But it's not necessarily as simple as that. Because when you get into the detail, what you find is that that first year term, in that first year term, the artist has to commit to doing certain things. If those things have not been completed in the first year, that contract term will get automatically extended until they are completed. So what may start out as a year might run to a year and a half, for instance. So when you actually get into the detail, and this is where we get into the rights, what you're giving the record company. When we get into the detail, you might find that you are obliged to provide an album's worth of material. An album will probably be defined as 10 songs. Okay? Not only do you have to deliver them, but the company has to accept them. The company has to be happy with what you've delivered. So you may deliver your album in 12 months. The company might then take, say, 3 or 4 weeks to decide that they're happy with it, at which point they will exercise the option. But you're now already over the 12 months. Typically what the company will want, they will want a period of time to, this is a word you will find in most contracts, to exploit the recordings, to release them and see how they're doing before they commit to the next payment. Okay? So this is the kind of thing which lends itself to an extension of the original contract term. So when you look at the contract and it says, this contract will be for 3 years, do not assume that it will finish in 3 years. Okay? It could actually run up to probably 5 years. Because by the time you have the little delays and little extensions, the contract inevitably gets extended. The territory. Generally, the territory, certainly in any major deal, but this is probably much more relevant here in Barbados, will be for a certain geographical area. So if you're doing a contract here, would you be doing a deal just for Barbados? Or would you be doing it for the Caribbean and North America? Or for, or the world? In record contracts, you will often find, and I think you'll probably find it in the sample contract I sent you out, the territory is the world and the solar system. Okay? So it leaves nothing to chance. If you're on the International Space Station, you are still going to be governed by the terms of this contract. The territory can obviously be important and can be significant, especially for local artists. If you are doing a deal with a local record label, do you want to grant them rights for the world if they have no experience of operating outside your own territory? The rights. The rights covers what you are obliged to provide to the company and what the company can then do with what you provide to them. So, as I used as an example, if you're obliged to provide an album, there will be a definition of what constitutes an album. And again, as I said, I've written this in shorthand. The definitions of what everything means will normally come right at the start of the contract. After who the parties are, there will normally be definitions of what is meant by an album, what is meant by a single, what is meant by a counting period. All these things will be clearly defined at the start of the contract before you actually get into the detail, so there could be no misunderstanding of what is meant. So the rights will be spelled out. What are you granting to the company, and what can the company do with what you are granting to them? Yesterday, of course, when we were talking about copyright, and what's kind of one of the reasons we started talking about copyright, I made it clear that copyright is a property right. It can be bought and sold. It can be transferred. I think in John's presentation, he pointed out that these days, more often, you will license your rights. So you will grant the company the right to exploit your work for a period of time, and then those rights will come back to you. Traditionally, major record company deals, you grant people the right for life of copyright, which here would be for 50 years from the date of first publication. Okay? If it's a song, 50 years after the death of the last writer, as we talked about yesterday. So, God, it's a very short fuse, this. Next on my list is the royalty. As I said, things won't necessarily come in this order, but I'm putting in this order just for it helps in terms of remembering. The royalty will set out what you will be paid for the various rights that you grant, record company, publisher, manager. This template should cover pretty much all the various types of agreements that you will find in the record industry. And I will go through how these various headings apply to different types of contracts as we go through the day. So the royalty, how much are you going to get paid? Again, in a recording contract, what will happen is you will be given a headline royalty figure. You will get paid 20% of gross earnings, or 20% of net receipts, or 20% of profit, or whatever it happens to be. This will be the headline royalty rate. As I said in my preamble, generally speaking, in a standard recording contract, the first 3 pages will set out the royalty rate that you will get. The rest of the contract will tell you why you're not going to get that, because it will be reduced from that headline rate by all kinds of things. So for instance, if you employ a studio producer, the studio producer will get a royalty, probably 2, 3, 4%, 5%, depending on how powerful that producer is. That royalty that is paid to the studio producer will come from the headline royalty rate that you are quoted in the contract. So if you're quoted a headline royalty rate of 20% and you're paying the producer 5%, your royalty will actually be 15%. There will then be all kinds of other deductions and reductions from the royalty. So for instance, there will probably be no royalty payable on promotional copies of your record. So the company can decide how many copies they're going to give away. You get nothing for those promotional copies. There will often be a half-rate royalty payable if the album is television advertised. So automatically, again, your headline royalty rate of 20% can be cut in half at a stroke when you actually go through the details of the paperwork. So don't just go by the headline. You have to go through the contract, look at the headline details, and then look at the various deductions and what they apply to. Retention. This is also a very important point. Retention is how long will the company that you are dealing with have the right to exploit your product? And how long will they hold on to that right after the end of the agreement? In my little letter that I circulated, there are those two words, in perpetuity. Okay. In perpetuity means forever. Generally, you don't want it to go on forever. Okay? In the letter, I put those words in just to show how important two words can be in a contract if you don't read it properly. Okay? Normally, the retention will be for a period of time. If you're doing a record deal, the traditional deals, as I've said, will last for life of copyright. But if you are licensing a deal, you will probably do it for a much shorter period of time. You will license it to the company for maybe 10 years, maybe 15 years, and then at the end of that period of time, it should be set out when those rights revert to you. Okay? So that is what is meant by retention. Advances. In our industry, it is what is known as a speculative business. Right? You have to speculate to accumulate. So the nature of the speculation on behalf of the company is putting up a sum of money which they are betting, effectively, on how successful you are going to be. So the advances kind of represent that bet. The key thing to know about advances in this business, for the most part, there are one or two cases where this doesn't apply, but advances are recoupable but not returnable. Let me explain that. When an advance is made to an artist under a record agreement or a publishing agreement, the company will then be entitled to recoup that money from money that your record or your song makes. Okay? They can get back any money they paid you up front from the earnings of your product. What they cannot do is come to you after a year and say, I gave you $10,000 advance, your record has only made $1,000, give me my $9,000 back. Okay? It is recoupable from the earnings, but not returnable. It is not a loan. If it is a loan, then they would be entitled to come and ask you for the money back if it doesn't earn it. if he doesn't earn enough. Okay? Here, the only way they can get their money back is making sure that your product sells enough for them to recoup. So this is one of the key parts of the speculation that the company has to make. And it's kind of an essential part of the business in which we operate. The company, when you actually look at the detail of a contract, it is normally fairly heavily biased in favor of the company. The reason why they are able to get away with that bias is because they are speculating, they are betting some of their money up front.
This is an area that I am so interested in because of the experiences that I've had. The artists must be really diligent in this particular area.
Yeah.
Because the company or the label can give you an advance.
Yeah.
You can be forever paying back that advance. If you do not know what your sales have been or what you've recouped, etc. We actually had to fight this with a major label, and we won. Because we recognized that we were recouping, and there was no way on God's earth that we didn't already satisfy that advance.
Right. Yeah, this is a very important point because, again, the business model of the traditional record, and I keep referring to the traditional record industry because, of course, nowadays a lot of this is breaking down. But I am talking about the way that the industry has operated and the way that the industry is set up to operate. And the way that it is set up to operate is that when a company pays you in advance, it is set up to operate in a way that actually they recoup their money a long time before you as the artist start to earn anything additional. And the reason for that is if you think about what I just said about the royalty rate, even at best, let's assume no deductions. Let's assume that you are going to get that 20% royalty that I talked about. The company is getting 80%. You are getting 20%. So when the money comes in and the company starts to recoup its money, it is recouping its money from your 20% share. That is the rate that you are paying back, 20% of what has been earned. The company, in the meantime, is getting 80% of what has been earned. So by the time you have got to the point where you have paid back the company what it advanced you from your 20%, they are already well ahead because they've been earning at 80%. Is that clear? Do people understand that? Okay? So the advances are an area that doesn't need to be paid attention to. And again, one of the reasons why we started yesterday talking about copyright and talking about neighbouring rights, because I pointed out that particularly the neighbouring rights part, which are a remuneration right, are not transferable by contract and will not come under this kind of agreement. They are an individual right. So that is the one area where the company cannot recoup any advances it has paid to you. That money is going to be yours regardless. The company can't say, oh, I paid you in advance for the recording contract, so I will take some of your neighbouring rights money. That money will go directly to the artist and the company cannot recoup from that. They have to recoup from record sales or synchronization licenses or whatever, but they cannot recoup from that, which is why the neighbouring rights money has become increasingly important to artists, because that is money they know they will get.
Keith, is that something that should be spelled out in the contract explicitly so that both parties understand it, or is it implied and so not necessary?
It is actually unnecessary because it cannot be transferred. I mean, it's important that the artist understands that because companies will try it on, but it shouldn't necessarily be spelled out in the contract. Okay, accounting. Now, this is an area which people often neglect, you know, because it sounds boring. It is really important.
Sorry. Richard.
Hey, Keith,
Yeah.
question.
Yeah.
me as an artist, if I don't take an advance,
Yeah.
what is the benefit to me, or what is the benefit to the company if I don't go ahead and take an advance?
Okay, that's quite a good question. The thing about not taking an advance is that obviously if you don't take an advance, then the company is paying you whatever the royalty rate is without deductions to pay back the advance. The downside is that you have not put the company under any pressure to work on your product, right? Because the thing about the advance is they can only recoup the advance if your product makes some money.
So I don't know if you'll deal with the digital environment specifically, but in our environment where we don't have, for example, the making available right,
Yeah.
in these types of contracts, because I don't know really clearly how it works here, if there's an assumption by the owner of the master that they control that right, and whether there's an accounting to artists or not. So in the case where there's a legislative gap, how is it, should you deal with the digital environment ban?
Okay, this is one of the things that should be explicitly spelt out in the contract. You know, all the details of how the advances will operate, how the recoupment will come, where the recoupment will come from, should be spelt out in the detail of the contract. You know, it depends on, you know, the different environments. In some cases these days, the release is digital only. So in which case, there will be no royalty reduction for packaging, or, you know, some of the other things which would appear in a physical contract.
But they do have, even in the digital environment, they do have the clauses for breakages and stuff.
Correct.
So.
You shouldn't allow that. Okay. There are certain legitimate costs, even for digital distribution, like the encoding, like the metadata I talked about before. There are certain legitimate costs, but breakages in the new business mean something else. Okay, the rec companies are quite adept at confusing people, right? Breakages in the modern business mean money which has been paid to the company for digital services which aren't actually specific. So, for instance, if you remember yesterday afternoon, I talked about Universal getting $20 million for an airline breaching their copyright. Okay? When that money comes in, Universal cannot necessarily identify exactly which artist the money should go to, right? So it will then decide what it's going to do with the money. In the modern business, they call that breakages. Okay? That money is breakage money, and they will decide what they're going to do with it. The artist won't necessarily get it. In my opinion, they should get it. But that's, you know, so they still have the same deductions. They've called them the same things. It means something different. In the UK, there's an organisation called the MMF, the Music Managers Forum, of which I used to be the chairman. And in fact, Chris Cook, who I believe came and did your copyright talk a few weeks ago, he actually wrote a small booklet which is called Dividing the Digital Dollar. Okay? And that breaks down exactly how the digital dollar in the new environment is divided. It is quite important, once you get into major contracts, to employ an accountant who can tell you what everything is. Okay? One of my favorite stories is a friend of mine who signed to Warner Brothers Records some time ago. And he had a very minor success. And he came into New York on a promo tour. And they met him at the airport in the long limo with the moon roof and the big television aerials on the back. And he got in the back, and the record company guy met him. He said, "Oh, this is great. Who's paying for all this?" And he said, "You are." Okay. because that is the reality. Okay. Now, obviously, I can't speak specifically to the Tony Braxton situation, but one of the problems with being an artist in this business is that everything happens in delayed fashion. So you get your advances, you will get your tax bill for that advance approximately 2 years after the advance hits your bank account, by which time you have probably spent all the advance. Remember that a significant percentage of that advance belongs to the taxman, right? So if you don't set that aside, that is when you're going bankrupt, right? The other big problem for artists is a lot of the time, it is very difficult, especially when you have a measure of success, as Tony Braxton did, to realize that that success is not going to, again, John touched on this yesterday, is not necessarily going to be continuous. In any artist's career, there are peaks and troughs. Some years you do very well, some years you do very badly. But the tax bills are always 2 years behind. So quite often what happens is your big bill appears just when you are doing the worst, right? The taxman does not wait. This is something which, regardless of what the details of the contract says, is always true, okay? You need to pay your tax bill when it is presented. If you have very good accountants, very clever accountants, they might be able to work out a payment schedule for you. But if you have spent all the money and the taxman says, well, I cannot see where down the line you are ever going to be able to pay this back, you're bankrupt. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is start to look more specifically at certain areas of the industry. And I'm actually going to start with management. Right. The reason I'm going to start with the management contract is because in all the web of contractual agreements that we are talking about, the management contract is the one that cannot be enforced. Okay? Now, I'm talking about UK law and probably here in Barbados. America is slightly different, so let's just accept that from the moment and talk about how things operate. Certainly in the UK. When I say the management agreement cannot be enforced, what I mean is the management agreement is what is known as a service contract. The management will provide certain services to you for which you will pay them. The easiest analogy for me, probably not for everybody in this room, although if you pay attention to the news media, what I'm going to say will make sense. Okay? Are you all here aware of English Premier League football? Okay. So you will know that quite regularly the managers of Premier League teams get sacked, correct? Do you ever wonder why they can get sacked, these guys? At a day's notice. Because they have the same kind of service contract that artist managers have in the music industry. Right? Effectively, you think to yourself, well, what's the point in having a contract if you can just get sacked? The point is determining the amount of compensation that you will get when you get sacked. Okay? If you're in the music business, I use the word when because I don't want to be saying if. Okay? As for a manager, the contract is about determining how much compensation you are due when you get sacked. Okay? One of the reasons I say that is because part of the manager's role in the music industry is to get sacked. Okay? When I normally itemize the jobs that a manager does, getting sacked comes in there, in the list. Why is that? It's because all the other agreements I'm going to be talking about, all the other contracts, are commercial contracts. Effectively, money has changed hands in order for that contract to take place. the commercial details are legally binding in the contract, whereas the management agreement, like I say, is a service agreement for services which are going to be provided, which is slightly different. You cannot force an artist to be managed by somebody they don't want to be managed by. So the artist can say, I don't want to be managed by this guy anymore, I'm going to walk away. But if they have a contract, they have to be aware that they might have to pay compensation to that manager, unless the manager is in breach of the terms and conditions that were laid out in the contract. So this is the big difference. And why do I say then that the manager's job is to get sacked? It's because when things go wrong, and remember a few minutes ago I talked about how there are peaks and troughs in any artist's career. When things go wrong, and things inevitably go wrong at some point, is the artist going to blame themselves? No. Yeah. Is the record company going to blame themselves? No. So who is the one person that you can blame in that relationship? And clearly the one link which can be unbroken is the management link. Because obviously everybody knows if things are going wrong, something has to change. Same in football. When the team keeps losing all the time, the manager's not playing, but the relationship needs to change. So in order for the relationship to change between the club and what the performance is on the pitch, the one thing you can tinker with is the manager is the person in between. And if you think about a record agreement in the same way, if things are not working for the recording career for the artist can't, well, you can blame the artist, but at the end of the day, the record company is stuck with the artist they have signed. The artist is stuck with the record company they have signed to. The one link that you can break in the chain to make a change, hopefully for the better, is the management link. So the management contract is the one which is the most fragile, and it is one of the reasons why, and somebody mentioned this to me yesterday, you will find that now a lot of the management contracts try to take a part of your publishing income as part of the agreement to manage the artist. Because the management are very sensitive to the fact that when the contract gets broken, they are kind of left with nothing. If they have a percentage of the publishing income, that will go on for a long period of time, and it will show them some benefit for their work, and it is covered by a commercial contract which cannot so easily be broken. Speaking as a manager, you know, I tend to be in favour of something which will reflect a return for the work that has been put in, right? Knowing how fragile the position is. Speaking as an artist, the idea of signing away a part of my publishing for a long period of time is not really, you know, a great move, because part of the problem with this is double payments. So let's assume that you have sacked your first manager. The second manager then comes in, and they will want to get paid on everything you earn. But you have already agreed to pay your first manager, say 20%. If you then engage the second manager and they're also taking 20%, you are now paying a 40% management royalty. So, you know, it depends where you stand. And it also, as I've said yesterday, it depends on the bargaining power you have as an artist. How badly do you want this manager to work for you? Are they going to make that much of a difference that you need them? And if so, maybe that's what you have to do. John.
Thanks, Keith. We got quite a bit of experience. I think I said yesterday that the union in the UK taking lots of legal cases against managers to get the artists, to help the artists get out of these service contracts. In fact, it's not difficult for them to do that. No. But one of the issues, and it relates to a question that was asked earlier about what if the artist didn't take an advance, just wanted a higher royalty. Now, we actually tell young artists, you know, don't get these kind of dollar signs in front of your eyes when they talk about a big advance, because you'll pay it back. think about the royalty rate, that's going to be sustaining you for a long while. In our experience, because of the volatility of the management contract, managers tend, and I say tend, not all of them, to want a pretty big advance because they get their 20% or whatever the percentage in there, and it's guaranteed for them. And on the publishing thing, I mean, we do, when people ask advice, we tell them not to do that because, as Keith says, it compounds because things move on. And some of the managers do quite well out of those percentages. So it's kind of, because it's the relationship is quite volatile, I tend to think it disadvantages the artist in the long run.
Okay, to play devil's advocate to that, because that's kind of my job here. One of the things about an artist getting a recording advance or a publishing advance is that quite often it represents quite a long period of work by both the artist and the manager without getting paid. Because up until that point, there has been no significant payday for the manager. They've put in all this work in terms of getting the artist ready to sign the deal, finding the deal, and doing the deal. And only when that advance comes through do they get an initial payment. They might have worked for 2 years with nothing. So, you know, the manager getting paid a reasonable amount from the advance under those circumstances seems a lot more, you know, acceptable. You know, people often forget that the manager earns, typically in the UK contracts, about 20% of what the artist earns. That is 1/5. So if they've been working for 2 years, is it not reasonable for them to get 1/5 of what the artist gets at the time the advance is paid? Yeah. Because again, typically, and if you look at the management contract that I circulated from the Musicians Union, it makes it clear that the manager will be responsible for all their own office costs, yeah, and organizational costs. The artist will not be paying for that. So although the management might be getting 20% commission, there are significant business expenses coming from that 20%. So it shouldn't be looked on as if the manager is getting all this money, you know, free. It's not as straightforward as that.
Can you speak to the characteristics you should look for in a good manager?
Yes. Okay, let me just say this about management, because again, people often say to me, so what is a manager? You know, and my definition, the manager is the interface between art and commerce. Okay? Now, those of you who work in the world of computing will know, all those people who are Star Wars fans will know that an interface is effectively a translator, right? It translates one type of language into another. And the manager usually occupies that role. So, what the manager has to understand is the interface. They have to understand what the artist is trying to accomplish on one side of the argument. On the other side of the argument, they have to understand the commercial imperative for the record company, the publisher, the promoter, whoever is doing the commercial work on behalf of the artist. They have a commercial imperative. They need to make a profit. Okay? The manager has to understand both worlds and translate between the two. So a good manager can ride that horse quite effectively. An example, just to make it clear what I'm talking about. An artist spends 6 months in the studio recording an album. The manager then takes it into the record company and plays it to the A&R person that's commissioning the record and says, here's the album. What do you think? The A&R person listens through the album and says, it's terrible, there are no singles. So the manager then goes back to the artist and says, what did he say? the man says, well, he says it's quite good, but maybe you can make some tracks which are more radio friendly. Okay? Because if the manager repeats what the A&R person said, the relationship is dead, right? But they kind of have to continue to work together. So this is what I'm talking about, being that interface. You're understanding what the person really is driving at from the record company from a commercial point of view, but understanding the fragility of the artist's ego, what's the artistic sensibilities on the other side, and translating the two. So that's one of the key things of being a good manager. Second thing is you need a degree of integrity as a manager. You actually need to be honest, both with yourself and with the artist, at those key moments. You cannot just always tell the artist what they want to hear. Yeah? You will not necessarily tell the artist in public that they are wrong, but privately you need to have those conversations. So it's important. And then, I guess from then, it's a matter of personal preference. You know, different artists will be looking for different things from different managers. It depends on what stage of their career they are and what their requirements are. You know, to give you an example, in the olden days, I'm really talking about the olden days, management companies would do everything for the artist. That happens much less now. Yeah. There is a famous story about a heavy metal band called Motorhead, right? And the lead singer, who died last year, Lemmy, and he's going to New York for the first time without a record deal, right? Before that, every time he's had a record deal, and the company takes care of everything. They pick him up at the airport, they do everything for him. So before he leaves, the management comes and say, look, Lemmy, you're going to New York, you have no record deal. There will be no car picking you up at the airport. You're going to have to do that for yourself. Get to the hotel, here's the details. And off he goes. 6 hours later, 7 hours later, they get a call from New York, from the airport, and it's Lemmy. I'm at the airport in New York, how do I get to my hotel? Lemmy, we told you, there's no car, you have no record deal. You have to get a taxi. Yeah, how do I do that? Well, go outside and put your hand up. You know, the yellow cars, you'll see them, you know, one of them will stop, you get in. He says, okay, all right, I'll try that. An hour and a half later, get another phone call. So what's up? Yeah, I'm in the hotel. Yeah, it's fine, yeah. One of those cars stopped, like you said. Right? When's my luggage going to arrive? Because, of course, up until now, there's always been a tour manager taking the luggage off the carousel. So, it depends. Let's look now at the recording agreement. Like I say, we talked about the term, how long it lasts. Beware of all the extensions in those option periods. A 3-year, what says 3 years at the start of a record deal, will normally run to at least 5 because of all the delays. So for instance, when you turn in your album, the company will normally say, we want 90 days from the handing in of your album, the acceptance of your album, before we have to exercise our first option. And their argument for that is, okay, you've given us the record, we need to find out how commercially successful it's going to be before we decide we're going to move to the next period. Because when they exercise the option, that is when the next advance is due. So they don't want to commit to spending any more money until they know how well your record is going to do. So that 90 days, that's 3 months. Right? So you hand in the record, even if you hand in the record on time, your deal has already been extended by 3 months. And when you consider that on every option period, you can see that on a 3-year deal, the shortest you're likely to come out is 5 years. Okay? So on a record deal, that's important. The territory, again, consider whether or not the record company that you are dealing with is equipped to deal with the world if you are going to grant them rights for the world. Okay? Make sure that whatever rights you grant for the territory are appropriate for the company that you are dealing with. The rights, again, these days, you should be looking to license your rights rather than giving the record company your rights for life of copyright, which is 50 years from the date of first publication. So much can happen in the industry and the way the industry works that to grant a company your rights for 50 years in the modern environment does not make sense. Yeah. The royalty, don't just look at the headline and assume that's what you're going to get. Remember, first 3 pages tell you what you're going to get. The rest of the contract tells you why you're not going to get that. So the royalty is not that headline rate that you see. There are many deductions. Retention. 2 little things in the retention clause in a recording contract. Normally, the company will insist that you will not re-record any of the material that you have given them for a period of at least 5 years after the contract comes to an end. Okay, that's because I'm sure you know that quite often what happens is an artist has one big song. Everybody knows that song. They could then go in the studio and record the song again and give it to another label. So now the original label is competing with a new label that have the same song. So the company normally will insist, as part of the retention, that you will not re-record any of the material that you have given them for at least 5 years. Yeah? And that, again, to me seems like a reasonable insistence. Advances, again, remember, advances are exactly what they say they are. They're advances you will be paying them back if you are successful. Okay? Remember, key things on advances: recoupable but not returnable. It is not a loan. If the company does not make enough money, they cannot ask you for that money back. They have to recoup the money for money that you have earned. And accounting. Okay, now this is a clause that people often neglect, but is very important. When are you going to be paid your money? How can you make sure that you have been paid what you are supposed to be paid? And that is going to be the clause that talks about how and when you can inspect the company's books to see what has been earned. Okay? And more importantly, what happens if the company has underpaid you? Right? Now normally, and this is actually quite normal, but something I certainly insist on in any deal I do, if the company has underpaid you by more than 10% of what they owe, 2 things happen. The first is they will immediately pay you that 10% plus interest for the accounting period concerned. The second thing that needs to happen is if they have underpaid you by 10%, they should pay for your audit of their books. Okay? As a way of discouraging companies from deliberately under-accounting to you. There has to be a penalty. If they have accounted to you wrongly and is more than an acceptable margin of error, and 10% in my opinion is an acceptable margin of error in a complex business. But if they have underpaid you by more than that, the penalty for them is that they will pay the cost of the accountant going through their books and finding the error. Okay? So don't ignore accounting. Okay, so that's basically the bones of the record deal. There are some specifics which we can talk about at the end of the afternoon when we have the question and answer.